They were not supposed to exist. In the steaming swamps of Veracruz, 12 tons of basalt stared back with human eyes, lips pursed, helmets carved, faces frozen in eternal command. Colossal heads, dragged across rivers without wheels, without beasts of burden, without explanation. Who carved them? Who ruled through them? 1,000 years before the Maya raised their glyphs, before the Aztec gods demanded blood, the Olmecs had already built cities that rose from mud like visions of stone. San Lorenzo, La Venta, places where kings spoke as shamans, where jaguars were men, where rain and maize were gods. Buried deep, they left mosaics of jade arranged in patterns no living eye was meant to see again. They hid offerings as if they feared the future would desecrate them. They were right. The Olmecs vanished. Not in fire, not in conquest. They simply dissolved like smoke, leaving behind thrones, tombs, and faces too vast to ignore. Their symbols infected every culture that came after, yet their own names were swallowed whole. No scrolls, no voices, only the weight of stone pressing down through centuries. History calls them the mother civilization, but the truth feels older, stranger, like a presence that never left the jungle, watching, silent, waiting. Mist clings to the swamps of Veracruz and Tabasco, where rivers twist through the dense lowlands and spill into the Gulf of Mexico. In this landscape of fertile floodplains and shifting waterways, the first great civilization of Mesoamerica took root. Long before the Maya built towering pyramids or the Aztecs commanded Tenochtitlan, the Olmecs were already carving their world into permanence. Between roughly 1500 and 400 BCE, they rose from the mud of riverbanks to create ceremonial centers, colossal monuments, and an enduring cultural framework that later societies would inherit, reshape, and carry forward. The land was not accidental. It was chosen. The low, humid basin of southern Mexico was unpredictable, yet abundant. The rivers, the Coatzacoalcos, the Tonala, the Papaloapan, and dozens of smaller streams, offered transport, water for crops, and fish for food. The swamps yielded fertile soil for maize, beans, and squash, the staples that underpinned life. Seasonal floods replenished the earth, while the nearby Gulf provided salt and marine resources. But this environment also demanded control. It tested those who lived within it, forcing them to master water management, to build platforms above the floodplains, and to tame landscapes where standing water and disease shaped human survival. To endure here required innovation. The Olmecs answered. Archaeologists identify the earliest Olmec communities around 1500 BCE. Their settlements scattered along the riverbanks of present-day Veracruz and Tabasco. These were not simple farming villages. Evidence suggests rapid social development. Ceremonial platforms raised on artificial mounds, specialized craft production, and the beginnings of centralized leadership. The Olmecs became the first in Mesoamerica to form what can truly be called a complex society, an organized network of elites, laborers, artisans, and farmers bound together by ritual, belief, and shared identity. By 1200 BCE, San Lorenzo emerged as the first great Olmec center. Built upon a plateau above the Coatzacoalcos River, it grew into a hub of political and religious power. From here, leaders commanded labor forces to reshape the landscape. Basalt was quarried from the Tuxtla Mountains, some blocks weighing more than 20 tons, and transported across rivers and swamps without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools. With this stone, the Olmecs carved colossal heads, thrones, and monuments unlike anything the Americas had ever seen. Each colossal head, standing over 2 meters tall, bore the features of an individual ruler, preserved in stone with an intensity that spoke of authority and permanence. These were not generic portraits. They were specific, individualized faces, their expressions fixed as if still watching over the land. The monumental effort required to transport and carve these heads reveals a society capable of organizing vast numbers of people. Such projects were not the work of scattered villages. They reflected centralized command, hierarchy, and a worldview that justified the expenditure of immense labor for the glorification of rulers and gods. The Olmecs were establishing patterns that would echo through Mesoamerican history. The divine ruler, monumental art, and cities that fused political and spiritual functions. At the heart of Olmec life was agriculture, centered on maize cultivation. By 2000 BCE, maize had already been domesticated in Mesoamerica, but the Olmecs raised it to a new scale. The crop was not merely food, it was sacred. Maize deities appear in Olmec art, often depicted with sprouting heads or maize stalks emerging from crowns. The fertile floodplains allowed for surplus production, which supported population growth, specialization of labor, and elite classes who could devote themselves to ritual, governance, and art. Religion shaped everything. The Olmec worldview was complex, filled with gods tied to rain, maize, and fertility. The jaguar was central, half predator, half spirit, its imagery fused with human features in the so-called war-jaguar motif. Rulers acted as shamans, mediating between the human world and the supernatural through ritual, bloodletting, and offerings. This religious order reinforced political control, binding communities together under the belief that their leaders held divine power to influence rain, fertility, and the cycles of life. It was this combination, control of agriculture, mastery of rivers, monumental art, and sacred rulership, that made the Olmecs the first to build a society recognizable as a civilization in Mesoamerica. Yet from the very beginning, scholars have argued over their role. Were they the mother culture, the source from which Maya, Zapotec, and Aztec traditions sprang? Or were they one of many sister cultures, part of a wider web of innovation that developed simultaneously across the region? The debate is not trivial. Archaeological evidence shows that Olmec influence extended far beyond Veracruz and Tabasco. Jade figurines in Olmec style have been found hundreds of kilometers away, in the Valley of Mexico and beyond. Their motifs, jaguars, serpents, rulers seated on thrones, appear in distant sites, hinting at a cultural reach that crossed regions. Some argue this proves the Olmecs directly shaped later civilizations. Others maintain that Mesoamerica was a mosaic of cultures, each borrowing from the other, with the Olmecs simply one among several experimenting with complexity. Still, the weight of their achievements is undeniable. Between 1500 and 400 BCE, the Olmecs were carving colossal monuments while other communities remained village-based. They were designing ceremonial centers, arranging plazas and pyramids in ways that foreshadowed later Mesoamerican cities. They may have developed early writing and calendar systems, though the evidence remains fragmentary. What is clear is that they created a cultural blueprint, the ruler as sacred mediator, the city as a cosmic stage, the ballgame as ritual drama, that would be repeated for centuries after they disappeared. The landscape itself carried their memory forward. The basalt heads remain scattered across Veracruz and Tabasco, their presence undeniable, their origin unmistakable. The swamps that once sustained the Olmecs preserved the remnants of their offerings: jade, serpentine, and clay figurines buried in marshy soils as gifts to the gods. The rivers that fed their fields also carried their influence outward, linking distant communities through trade and exchange. To understand the Olmecs is to stand in that humid basin where rivers and sea converge, where maize fields bordered swamps, and where colossal heads once gazed across plazas filled with ritual. It is to recognize that in the mud and mist of Veracruz and Tabasco, the first great experiment in Mesoamerican civilization began. Not in the highlands, not in the deserts, but in the swamps, where abundance and danger coexisted, and where human ambition shaped a society that would echo through the ages. Around 1200 BCE, in the heart of the Gulf Coast lowlands, San Lorenzo rose above the surrounding swamps like a declaration of power. It was not the largest settlement by population in Mesoamerica, but it was the first to bear the unmistakable mark of centralized authority, monumental planning, and the ability to command labor on a scale never before seen in the Americas. Where earlier communities had been little more than villages strung along fertile rivers, San Lorenzo transformed into something far greater, a political and ceremonial capital that set the standard for what a city could mean in Mesoamerican civilization. San Lorenzo sat upon a natural plateau above the Coatzacoalcos River. Its elevation gave it both protection from seasonal flooding and a vantage point over the fertile plains that stretched out around it. Yet the plateau was not left in its natural state. The Olmecs reshaped it, cutting, leveling, and building to create terraces, plazas, and platforms that imposed human order upon the landscape. Archaeologists estimate that thousands of cubic meters of earth were moved to reconfigure the site. This was not the random growth of a village. It was intentional design, evidence of leaders who could command and direct vast amounts of communal labor. Within San Lorenzo, the architecture revealed hierarchy. Elite residences occupied raised platforms, physically elevated above common dwellings, reinforcing the separation between rulers and those who served them. Stone monuments, thrones, altars, and colossal heads stood in carefully arranged plazas, turning public space into a theater of power. The sheer labor required to produce these features demonstrates a political system in which leaders held both the authority and the religious legitimacy to mobilize entire communities. The control of water was one of San Lorenzo's most extraordinary achievements. Beneath its plazas and platforms, the Olmecs engineered a system of basalt drains and channels that directed water across the city. Some drains were carved from single blocks of basalt, their smooth surfaces guiding water with precision. Others were fitted together from multiple pieces, creating networks that could carry water for irrigation, sanitation, or ritual. These were not crude constructions. They were highly planned systems that show an advanced understanding of hydraulic engineering. The basalt used for the drains came from the Tuxtla Mountains, more than 60 kilometers away, meaning each piece had to be transported through rivers and swamps without the aid of wheels or draft animals. The investment in such infrastructure demonstrates both technical ingenuity and the centralized organization required to coordinate the work. It is in San Lorenzo, too, that the most iconic symbols of Olmec civilization emerged: the colossal stone heads. Each one stands between 2 and 3 meters tall, weighing up to 25 tons, carved from single blocks of basalt transported from the volcanic Tuxtlas. The logistics are staggering. Without beasts of burden, without wheeled carts, the Olmecs quarried the basalt, shaped it, and then dragged it over rivers, swamps, and forests. The most likely method was through a combination of rafts along waterways and sheer human labor on land. Every head represents months, perhaps years, of coordinated effort involving hundreds of workers. The faces carved into these heads are not abstract or anonymous. They are individualized, detailed, and specific. Thick lips, broad noses, distinctive helmets, all features suggesting depictions of actual rulers. Archaeologists believe they were portraits of kings, immortalized in stone to project authority long after death. Their placement in plazas or near elite residences further emphasizes their function as symbols of rulership, broadcasting the power of individuals who could command both the living and the eternal memory of stone. In these sculptures, the Olmecs articulated the idea of the ruler as the embodiment of the state, a tradition that would echo through Maya kingship and Aztec emperorship centuries later. The colossal heads were not the only monuments. San Lorenzo yielded thrones, massive stone blocks carved with niches and figures that may represent rulers emerging from caves, symbols of power tied to the earth itself. Altar 4, one of the most famous, depicts a ruler seated within such a niche, grasping a rope that binds a smaller, subordinate figure. The imagery conveys dominance, control, and the ruler's ability to mediate between the human and supernatural worlds. These thrones reinforced the notion that rulership was not only political but cosmological. Kings were seen as intermediaries between their people and the gods, their authority sanctioned by divine forces. The city reached its height between 1200 and 900 BCE. At its peak, San Lorenzo's influence extended across the Gulf Coast and beyond. Trade networks brought obsidian from the highlands, jade from the Motagua Valley of Guatemala, serpentine and magnetite from mirrors, and shells from coastal waters. The elites of San Lorenzo controlled this flow of goods, reinforcing their status and authority. Exotic materials were transformed into finely crafted objects: jade masks, polished mirrors, and ceremonial figurines. These were not everyday items but ritual symbols, objects of prestige that circulated within elite networks and were deposited in offerings that tied political power to religious devotion. Archaeological evidence shows that the population surrounding San Lorenzo was not small. Farmers, artisans, and laborers lived in dispersed communities around the core, feeding and supplying the city. Their work sustained the elite's monumental projects. This structure, center and periphery, elite and commoner, was the prototype of Mesoamerican urban society. The foundations of later Maya and Aztec social hierarchies can be traced to the organization seen here. Yet San Lorenzo's power was not eternal. Around 900 BCE, the city declined. Monuments were deliberately defaced, heads reburied or moved, thrones broken. The reasons remain debated. Some argue for ecological stress, river shifts that undermined agriculture, depletion of resources, or flooding that disrupted life. Others suggest internal political upheaval, rebellion against ruling elites. The destruction of monuments indicates more than abandonment. It suggests a violent rejection of the symbols of rulership that had once defined San Lorenzo's greatness. Still, for 3 centuries, San Lorenzo had been the heart of Olmec civilization, the first city to rise with the hallmarks of centralized authority, monumental art, and engineered landscapes. Its colossal heads stood as guardians of memory. Its drains carried water through a designed landscape. Its thrones proclaimed the link between rulers and gods. The Olmecs had proven that a city could be more than a cluster of homes. It could be a stage where power, ritual, and human ambition reshaped the land itself. Around 900 BCE, the center of Olmec power shifted. San Lorenzo, once the supreme seat of authority, was abandoned, its monuments toppled and its rulers' faces defaced. In its place, another city rose to dominance further east along the Tabasco coast. La Venta became the new heart of Olmec civilization, and for nearly 5 centuries, from 900 to 400 BCE, it stood as the most powerful ceremonial and political center in Mesoamerica. What began as a settlement on a low island in a swamp was transformed into a sacred landscape of pyramids, plazas, and ritual deposits, a blueprint that later Maya and Aztec cities would follow. The scale of La Venta was unprecedented. At its core lay a massive ceremonial precinct, arranged on a north-south axis with geometric precision. The most striking feature was the Great Pyramid, an earthen mound rising over 30 meters high, shaped to resemble a sacred mountain. It was not made of stone, but of thousands of tons of clay carefully layered to form a monumental structure dominating the surrounding plain. This artificial mountain expressed an idea central to Olmec cosmology. The mountain was the axis of the universe, the place where the human and divine worlds met. By building their own sacred mountain, the rulers of La Venta turned their city into a cosmic stage, a place where ritual and rulership fused into one. Around the pyramids stretched broad plazas, platforms, and smaller mounds arranged in orderly patterns. The plazas were not empty spaces. They were stages for public ritual, where rulers performed ceremonies that reaffirmed their role as intermediaries between the people and the supernatural. The orientation of the site reflects deliberate cosmological planning. Archaeological studies show alignments connected to astronomical cycles, especially the movements of the sun, suggesting that rituals were tied to agricultural and calendrical events. La Venta was more than a settlement. It was a ceremonial city designed to embody cosmic order. The art and symbolism of La Venta reveal the worldview that sustained this sacred order. The jaguar, already a central figure in Olmec religion, took on heightened importance. Hybrid figures with feline features, snarling mouths, almond-shaped eyes, downturned mouths, appear in carvings and figurines. Scholars call these the were-jaguar forms, representations that blur the line between human and animal, ruler and shaman, physical and supernatural. To the Olmecs, the jaguar was not only a predator of the forest but a being of supernatural power, a bridge between worlds. The rulers of La Venta likely styled themselves as jaguar shamans, men capable of transformation, whose authority rested on their ability to channel divine forces. This religious authority was reinforced through ritual offerings of extraordinary scale and symbolism. Beneath La Venta's ceremonial floors, archaeologists have found massive buried mosaics made of carefully arranged serpentine blocks. Each mosaic, composed of hundreds of pieces of greenstone, formed abstract patterns, cross-like shapes, and jaguar masks that were never meant to be seen by the living once completed. After construction, they were immediately covered with clay and sealed, turning them into hidden offerings to the gods of earth and fertility. Such acts demonstrate the Olmec belief that the city itself was alive, nourished through offerings buried in its foundations. Other offerings reveal the wealth and power concentrated at La Venta. Hundreds of jade figurines and celts were deposited in ritual caches. One of the most famous, Offering 4, contained 16 figurines of jade and serpentine arranged in a ceremonial tableau, facing a row of 6 upright jade celts. The arrangement suggests a reenactment of ritual or political gathering, preserved eternally beneath the earth. Jade, imported from Guatemala's Motagua Valley, was among the most precious materials in Mesoamerica, valued for its color and hardness. Its presence in such vast quantities at La Venta underscores both the reach of Olmec trade networks and the willingness of rulers to sacrifice immense wealth for religious purposes. The burials of La Venta further emphasize the blending of political and religious power. Elite tombs, lined with wooden planks and filled with jade, hematite, and serpentine objects, have been found beneath ceremonial platforms. The dead were laid to rest as rulers who carried their authority into the afterlife. In some cases, masks of jade and other stones may have symbolized transformation, turning the deceased into supernatural beings. The effort invested in these burials reinforces the central idea of Olmec rulership, that kings were not ordinary men but sacred figures whose existence maintained the balance between humanity and the divine. La Venta also continued the tradition of colossal heads, though fewer survive than at San Lorenzo. These heads, carved from basalt transported from the Tuxtla Mountains more than 80 kilometers away, were placed within the ceremonial precinct, their faces distinct, individualized, and stern. Each likely represented a specific ruler, immortalized in stone to project authority across generations. Their helmets, carved in detail, suggest both the attire of rulers and possible association with the Mesoamerican ballgame, a ritual sport with cosmic significance. The sheer logistics of transporting and carving these monuments again highlight the centralized power of La Venta's elite. Trade and exchange reinforced the city's dominance. From La Venta, goods flowed in and out across Mesoamerica. Jade, obsidian, magnetite, hematite, and exotic shells all passed through its networks. These materials carried symbolic as well as practical value. Magnetite mirrors, polished to high brilliance, were used in ritual for divination and fire-making, their surfaces thought to reflect the supernatural. Obsidian blades, sharp as razors, were used in bloodletting rituals. Every imported item was transformed into a religious tool, reinforcing the sacred authority of those who controlled them. The longevity of La Venta is striking. For nearly 500 years, it remained the dominant center of Olmec power, maintaining its ceremonial core while other settlements rose and fell. Its endurance speaks to the strength of its institutions and the binding force of its religious order. Yet by 400 BCE, La Venta too declined. Its monuments were defaced, its ceremonial life ended, its structures abandoned. But during its height, it crystallized the Olmec vision of rulership, cosmology, and sacred space in a way that set the foundation for all later Mesoamerican civilizations. La Venta was not simply a replacement for San Lorenzo. It was an evolution, where San Lorenzo displayed the power of individual rulers through colossal monuments and elite residences. La Venta elevated the entire city into a sacred landscape. Its pyramid rose like a mountain, its plazas aligned with the heavens, its offerings fed the earth itself. Every block of serpentine buried, every jade figurine interred, every colossal head erected was part of a system where rulers embodied gods, cities embodied the cosmos, and human labor was transformed into sacred permanence. The Olmecs lived in a world where every stone, river, and stalk of maize was charged with supernatural force. Their worldview was not abstract but embodied in images, rituals, and the daily rhythm of survival. Rain determined harvests, maize sustained life, and both were bound to deities whose favor could never be taken for granted. In the swamps and forests of Veracruz and Tabasco, the natural world was unpredictable, and in that uncertainty, religion became both explanation and weapon. The Olmecs gave form to gods of water and fertility, beings tied to the cycles that ruled existence. They left behind carved altars, jade figurines, and colossal monuments filled with symbols of rain, maize, serpents, and jaguars, each marking their attempt to control the forces on which life depended. At the center of their iconography was the jaguar. No single motif defines the Olmec more than the enigmatic word jaguar, a figure that fuses human and feline traits. Infants with downturned mouths, almond-shaped eyes, and cleft foreheads appear in sculptures and figurines, often in postures suggesting ritual significance. Some scholars argue these forms represent a rain deity, their features linked to fertility and agricultural abundance. Others see them as symbols of shamanic transformation, humans crossing into the supernatural realm by adopting the form of the most feared and revered predator of the lowland forests. The jaguar's strength, its nocturnal habits, and its dominance over other animals made it a powerful emblem of otherworldly authority. Whatever their precise meaning, the persistence of the motif across Olmec art shows it was fundamental to their religious imagination. Rulers themselves embodied this connection. They were not merely political figures but mediators between the human and divine. Olmec altars, carved with niches from which rulers emerge, depict them holding ropes that bind captives or link to smaller figures, symbols of control both physical and spiritual. Such imagery reinforces the belief that rulers carried shamanic power, the ability to cross into the supernatural world, communicate with gods, and bring back knowledge or blessings for their people. Shamans in Olmec society likely engaged in ritual practices involving trance, bloodletting, or hallucinogenic substances to achieve altered states of consciousness. In these states, they claimed access to realms beyond ordinary perception. When rulers presented themselves as both kings and shamans, they reinforced their authority with divine sanction. Their legitimacy rested not only on force or wealth, but on their ability to mediate the essential forces of life: rain, maize, fertility, and death. The rituals of the Olmecs were physical expressions of this worldview. Offerings buried beneath plazas and pyramids, jade celts, serpentine mosaics, figurines arranged in ceremonial tableaus, were gifts to the gods and ancestors. These were not random deposits but highly organized acts of devotion, with objects imported from distant regions placed carefully in patterns and then deliberately hidden beneath layers of earth and clay. The city itself became a sacred body, fed and renewed through offerings that tied human labor and wealth to supernatural obligation. One of the most enduring institutions to emerge from this religious system was the ball game. The Olmecs were the earliest known culture in Mesoamerica to play it, and they did so with balls made of rubber, a material they extracted from the latex of local trees. Archaeological finds of rubber balls dated to around 1600 BCE suggest that organized ritual sport existed before the rise of San Lorenzo, and by the time of La Venta, it was embedded in Olmec life. The game was not mere entertainment, it was a spectacle charged with religious meaning. The ball's movement across the court symbolized cosmic cycles: the sun crossing the sky, the battle between life and death, the struggle between order and chaos. Players may have represented gods or ancestors, their contest reenacting cosmic dramas that ensured the continuation of the world. The ball game also carried associations with sacrifice. While direct evidence of human sacrifice among the Olmecs is scarce compared to later Maya and Aztec practices, iconography suggests that bloodletting and offerings of life were tied to the game. Later cultures preserved this link explicitly. For the Maya, captives and sometimes players were sacrificed as part of ballgame rituals, their blood nourishing the gods of fertility and rain. Given the Olmecs' role as the earliest ballgame culture, the origins of this sacrificial association likely trace back to their ceremonial practices. The game was not separate from religion but a central expression of it, a public event that reaffirmed cosmic order through physical struggle. The influence of Olmec religion extended far beyond their own centers. Later Mesoamerican civilizations inherited and reshaped their symbols, myths, and ritual frameworks. The rain god that appears in Olmec art, often linked to jaguar features, anticipates the Maya Chac and the Aztec Tlaloc, both deities of water, fertility, and storms. The maize deity, central to Olmec life, resurfaces in the Maya maize god and in Aztec myths where maize is retrieved from the mountains by the gods. The role of rulers as sacred mediators became a permanent feature of Mesoamerican kingship. Maya Ajuab and Aztec Tlatoani ruled not just as political figures, but as divine representatives, expected to maintain cosmic balance through ritual performance and sacrifice. The Olmec precedent of leaders as shaman kings established this model centuries before it appeared in the monumental inscriptions of later empires. Even the practice of bloodletting, documented in later cultures, may have its roots in Olmec ritual. Figurines and carvings suggest acts of self-sacrifice, where elites pierced their skin to offer blood to the gods. The principle was clear: life must be given to sustain life, and human blood was the most potent offering. In later Maya and Aztec traditions, this belief became formalized into state-sponsored sacrificial systems, but its origins lie in the early religious concepts of the Olmecs, where rulers and shamans demonstrated their power by offering their own bodies to the supernatural. What remains of the Olmec religious system comes to us through fragments: stone carvings, buried offerings, rubber balls preserved in swamps, and jade figurines sealed in the earth. Yet even in fragmentary form, the power of their worldview is unmistakable. Every artifact reveals a society where the boundaries between human, animal, and divine were porous, where rulers claimed legitimacy through shamanic transformation, and where ritual was the foundation of political power. Their gods of rain and maize, their jaguar spirits, their ballgame rituals, and their offerings of jade and blood formed a system that not only sustained the Olmecs themselves but set the template for the great civilizations that followed. The Olmec world was not divided into sacred and secular. It was one continuous order, where life, politics, and the supernatural were bound together, and where every act of ritual reaffirmed humanity's fragile place within the cosmic balance. The Olmecs did not stand apart from their neighbors, isolated in the swamps of Veracruz and Tabasco. Their power rested on networks that reached far beyond their ceremonial centers. From the earliest days at San Lorenzo in the 1200s BCE, their influence spread through the circulation of materials, objects, and ideas. Their civilization rose in a land rich in rivers but poor in key resources. To build colossal heads, altars, and thrones, they quarried basalt from the distant Tuxtla Mountains. To carve their ritual figurines, they demanded jade from the Motagua Valley of present-day Guatemala. To craft blades and ceremonial tools, they drew obsidian from central Mexican highlands. Seashells traveled from the Gulf Coast, cacao moved through riverine routes, and in return the Olmecs distributed goods, images, and symbols that reshaped Mesoamerica. Every artifact of foreign stone in Olmec territory testifies to this trade. Jade was the most prized material, valued for its hardness, its luminous green color, and its connection to fertility and life. Olmec craftsmen transformed it into celts, beads, masks, and figurines, objects that carried not only aesthetic beauty but religious power. These jade pieces, buried in ceremonial caches at La Venta between 900 and 400 BCE, were not local creations alone, but the product of a network stretching hundreds of kilometers into the Guatemalan highlands. Obsidian, equally significant, came from sources such as Pachuca and Ucario in central Mexico. Its sharp edges made it useful for ritual bloodletting and weaponry, but in the hands of the Olmec elite it also became a marker of status, an item that linked them to distant regions. Basalt, heavy and unyielding, traveled shorter distances but required monumental labor to move. The colossal heads carved from it, some weighing over 20 tons, were dragged from the Tuxtla volcanic range across rivers and swamps, feats of organization that reinforced the authority of rulers who could command such resources. The presence of Olmec-style objects in distant lands shows that this trade was not one-sided. Sites across Mesoamerica bear traces of Olmec artistic influence, often in places where Olmec-style iconography appears on locally made objects. In the valley of Oaxaca, figurines with downturned mouths echo the war-jaguar motif. In the highlands of central Mexico, ceramics and monuments show stylistic parallels with Gulf Coast art. On the Pacific coast of Chiapas and Guatemala, pottery and jade ornaments reveal an unmistakable Olmec imprint. These were not accidental resemblances. They point to sustained contact, whether through exchange networks, visiting artisans, or direct political relationships. The question of how this influence spread remains central to the study of Olmec history. Some scholars once spoke of an Olmec horizon, suggesting that the Olmecs acted as colonizers, projecting their culture outward through military or political dominance. Under this view, the Olmecs were the first empire of Mesoamerica, imposing their religious symbols and artistic forms on surrounding peoples. Yet evidence for direct conquest is scarce. The Olmec heartland lacks inscriptions or monuments describing military expansion, and most regional sites with Olmec-style features show local adaptations rather than strict imitation. More likely, the Olmecs influenced through prestige and exchange, their art and rituals adopted because they represented power, sophistication, and connection to the supernatural. This pattern fits what is seen at La Venta, where monumental offerings of jade celts, many clearly imported, were arranged in mosaics and buried beneath the ceremonial core. The act of burying these imported objects shows that their value was not in their practical use but in their symbolism. They embodied distant lands, distant peoples, and the ability of Olmec rulers to command resources from afar. A ruler who could control jade from Guatemala, obsidian from central Mexico, and shells from the coasts presented himself as one who ruled not only his people but the wider world. Authority was expressed in the ability to pull the faraway into the local, to bind the material wealth of diverse landscapes into a single sacred center. The influence of Olmec style on later Mesoamerican civilizations cannot be overstated. The Maya adopted jade as the material of kingship, a tradition that began with Olmec usage. The Aztecs centuries later still viewed jade as more precious than gold, a hierarchy of value rooted in the Gulf Coast tradition. The war-jaguar and infantile rain deity figures found in Olmec art set precedents for the rain gods Chak and Tlaloc. Even the idea of rulers as intermediaries between human and divine, reinforced by Olmec iconography, spread across Mesoamerica through these early networks. Evidence of Olmec influence can be traced at sites like Calcatzingo in Morelos, where rock carvings show rulers seated in caves with flowing rain clouds, imagery strikingly similar to Olmec motifs of rulers emerging from supernatural portals. In Chiapas at Izapa, early monuments reveal a fusion of local and Olmec-derived styles, suggesting that Gulf Coast imagery had been adopted and reworked in new contexts. At Tres Zapotes, an Olmec site that outlived La Venta, later generations continued to carve monuments blending Olmec forms with emerging regional traditions, demonstrating how influence evolved rather than simply vanished. The circulation of cacao further underlines the Olmec's role in trade. The earliest known use of cacao residues dates back to Olmec times around 1500 BCE, showing that they may have been the first Mesoamerican people to cultivate and ritualize its consumption. Later civilizations, especially the Maya, would elevate cacao into a sacred beverage associated with gods and kings. But its roots, like those of jade and rubber, were tied to the networks the Olmecs helped establish. All of this makes the Olmecs the earliest known architects of long-distance exchange in the Americas. They built no empire in the conventional sense, but their symbols traveled farther than their armies ever could. When a figurine bearing Olmec features appears hundreds of kilometers away, it marks not an invasion but an idea carried along trade routes, embedded in goods exchanged, and adopted into new cultural contexts. This diffusion was no less powerful than conquest. Influence did not need to arrive on the tip of a spear when it could move through the hands of merchants, artisans, and ritual specialists who carried with them the prestige of the Gulf Coast. The archaeological record speaks of a civilization that understood the power of connection. Rivers became highways, jade became currency of the sacred, and iconography became the language through which power was expressed and shared. The Olmecs were not isolated. They were a civilization whose reach extended across mountains, valleys, and coasts, binding together diverse peoples of early Mesoamerica. Through trade and exchange, they ensured that their culture would not remain confined to Veracruz and Tabasco but would shape the religious, artistic, and political traditions of all that followed. San Lorenzo once stood as the unrivaled center of Olmec power, its colossal heads and massive earthen platforms a clear statement of authority over the surrounding lowlands. Yet by 900 BCE, the very heart of this center was abandoned. Archaeology shows that its monuments were deliberately defaced and toppled, colossal heads mutilated, basalt drains destroyed. What had once been a seat of rulers and shamans who mediated between human and divine now became silent ruins. The causes were not singular but layered, rooted in the environment, the shifting rivers that sustained the Olmec world, and the social strains of maintaining such monumental societies in the wet lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco. The land that nourished the Olmecs was also their greatest vulnerability. Their cities depended on the Coatzacoalcos river system, a lifeline for transport, agriculture, and trade. Yet the region was never stable. Sediment cores and geological studies reveal major river shifts during the late 2nd millennium BCE. Flooding events damaged fields, destroyed settlements, and altered waterways, undermining the very agricultural foundation on which San Lorenzo had been built. The swamps that had provided fish, shellfish, and fertile soil could just as easily swallow entire communities when the rivers changed course. A system of basalt drains at San Lorenzo suggests how much effort was required to manage water. But by the 10th century BCE, those efforts failed. The earthworks became clogged, water channels redirected, and the monumental center lost its purpose. As San Lorenzo fell, La Venta rose. Located on a natural island in the swampy terrain of Tabasco, La Venta became the new ceremonial hub between 900 and 400 BCE. It was here that Olmec rulers reasserted their authority through massive earthen pyramids, mosaic offerings of jade, and colossal sculptures carved from basalt dragged from the Tuxtla Mountains over 80 kilometers away. La Venta's Great Pyramid, rising 30 meters, stood as the largest structure in Mesoamerica at the time, an artificial mountain on the flat horizon. But even this ambitious center could not resist the pressures that had undone San Lorenzo. By around 400 BCE, La Venta too was abandoned, its monuments broken and buried, its ceremonial core left deserted. The decline was not the sudden collapse of a civilization but a series of transformations spread across centuries. Tres Zapotes in Veracruz continued as a regional center after La Venta's abandonment, yet its art marked a departure from earlier Olmec styles. The colossal heads carved here retained the tradition of monumental portraiture, but their features no longer matched the classic San Lorenzo or La Venta forms. Instead of one unified Olmec culture, there emerged a mosaic of successor societies, each reshaping inherited traditions to fit their own needs. Environmental stress was a constant factor. Palynological studies show that during the terminal Olmec period, forests around La Venta were cut extensively, soils exhausted, and agriculture stretched thin. Slash-and-burn farming could not indefinitely sustain dense populations, especially when floods and shifting river systems reduced the reliability of fields. Without the abundance that supported large centers and their ruling elites, monumental construction faltered. The labor needed to transport basalt or arrange jade mosaics vanished as communities dispersed. At the same time, the rise of competing centers in other regions drew power away from the Gulf Coast. In Oaxaca, Monte Alban was founded around 500 BCE, soon becoming a fortified hilltop city-state that exerted control over the valley below. On the Pacific coast, the site of Izapa flourished with new monumental traditions that drew on but reshaped Olmec iconography. By the late formative period, between 400 and 300 BCE, the Olmec heartland no longer held primacy in Mesoamerica. Ideas that had once flowed outward from San Lorenzo and La Venta now circulated independently across new cultural landscapes. The deliberate destruction of monuments at both San Lorenzo and La Venta suggests internal conflict, not only environmental failure. Colossal heads defaced and altars smashed point to struggles between factions or revolts against ruling elites. These were not mere abandonments caused by climate. They were acts of rejection, attempts to erase the memory of rulers who could no longer maintain control. The breaking of monuments had symbolic power. To shatter a colossal head was to sever the authority it represented, to strip legitimacy from dynasties who claimed to mediate between gods and men. What became of the Olmec people themselves remains one of archaeology's enduring puzzles. There is no evidence of a mass disappearance or extermination. Populations did not vanish. They shifted. The descendants of the Olmec heartland merged into the broader fabric of Mesoamerican societies. Their villages persisted in the floodplains, their traditions absorbed into later cultures. The art and symbolism they created lived on in the imagery of Maya rulers and the rituals of Central Mexican peoples. The Olmecs ceased to exist as a distinct political force, but their cultural imprint never left the stage. Archaeological excavations continue to refine the picture. At Tres Zapotes, Stela C bears one of the earliest long-count calendar dates, 32 BCE, demonstrating that even centuries after La Venta's abandonment, Gulf Coast peoples played a role in developing the calendrical systems that would dominate later Mesoamerican civilizations. At Laguna de los Cerros, another Olmec site, settlement persisted long after the so-called collapse, but without the monumental scale of earlier centers. These findings show continuity rather than disappearance, transformation rather than extinction. By 400 BCE, the Olmec world as it had been known, of colossal heads standing guard over ceremonial centers, of jade mosaics buried beneath pyramids, of rulers enthroned as intermediaries with rain and maize deities, was gone. Yet the ideas born in that swampy cradle had already migrated. The rain god became Tlaloc and Chak. The ball game spread across the lowlands and highlands. The conception of rulers as divine mediators embedded itself in the political theology of later states. The Olmecs no longer carved heads of stone, but their influence remained etched into the foundations of Mesoamerican civilization, carried forward not by their monuments, but by the peoples who inherited their vision. The Olmecs were the first to bend the landscape of Mesoamerica into something that went beyond survival, the first to shape earth and stone into ordered centers of power. Their ceremonial platforms at San Lorenzo and La Venta, rising above swamps and rivers, were not random accumulations of soil but deliberate architectural statements, precursors to the stepped pyramids that later defined Maya and Aztec cities. They aligned sacred space with cosmic order, embedding belief into architecture. By 1200 BCE, when San Lorenzo reached its height, the Olmecs had already demonstrated that a civilization could be built not on stone masonry but on earthworks, colossal in scale, commanding in purpose. These were the blueprints that others would expand, refine, and carry forward. Their artistic vision was equally enduring. The Olmecs created an iconographic system that fused human and divine, producing hybrid beings whose features resonated across centuries. The war-jaguar motif, human infants with feline mouths and almond-shaped eyes, appears in jade figurines, altars, and carvings. Scholars debate whether it represents a rain deity, a mythic origin story, or a ruler transformed through shamanic power. Whatever its precise meaning, the motif outlived its creators, reappearing in later depictions of deities associated with rain, fertility, and rulership. The Olmecs shaped a symbolic vocabulary that other cultures adopted, adapted, and reinterpreted. Inscriptions found at sites like Cascajal provide evidence that the Olmecs may have pioneered writing in Mesoamerica. The Cascajal block, a serpentine tablet dated to around 900 BCE, carries incised symbols arranged in deliberate sequences, the earliest known script in the region. Its characters, numbering at least 62 distinct signs, do not match later Maya glyphs or Zapotec script, yet their existence demonstrates that the Olmecs experimented with written language centuries before these later systems emerged. Though the script remains undeciphered, its very presence suggests that record-keeping, ritual codification, and possibly political authority were already intertwined in the Olmec world. The Olmecs also appear to have laid foundations for Mesoamerican calendrics. By the Middle Formative Period, evidence of ritual calendars linked to astronomical observation emerges across the region, and many scholars connect these developments to Olmec innovations. The alignment of ceremonial centers with solar and cardinal points hints at calendrical planning. At La Venta, the complex layout of mounds and plazas reflects intentional orientation, signaling that time and cosmos were embedded in urban design. Later civilizations, from the Maya with their intricate long count system to the Aztec Tonalpwali, carried forward the structuring of ritual life through calendars. The Olmecs provided the framework on which more elaborate systems would be built. Religion and rulership were inseparable in Olmec society. Colossal heads, carved from basalt boulders transported from the Tuxtla Mountains, immortalized the visages of rulers. Each weighing up to 40 tons, they were placed at ceremonial centers to mark authority and presence. These were not anonymous portraits. Their individualized features suggest living leaders transformed into eternal guardians. Their helmets hint at warfare or ritual ballgames, connecting rulership to both martial and sacred duties. Later Mesoamerican kings inherited this theology of rule. Authority rested not only on force but on divine sanction. From Teotihuacan to Tenochtitlan, rulers would present themselves as mediators between gods and people, a legacy rooted in Olmec political theology. The spread of Olmec influence is traceable in the material record. Jade figurines carved in the Gulf Coast style appear in distant regions like Oaxaca, Guerrero, and even the Pacific coast of Chiapas and Guatemala. Pottery bearing Olmec motifs has been excavated hundreds of kilometers from the Veracruz heartland. Sites such as Calcatzingo in central Mexico feature Olmec-style bas-reliefs, with figures seated in caves emerging from stylized mountains, symbols of fertility, rain, and rulership that mirror Gulf Coast imagery. These were not isolated borrowings but signs of an interconnected cultural world, bound by trade networks that carried obsidian, jade, iron ore, and cacao. Through exchange, the Olmecs projected their worldview far beyond their immediate homeland. The debate over whether the Olmecs were a mother culture or one among equals remains one of the most contested questions in Mesoamerican scholarship. The term mother culture, coined in the 20th century, reflects the striking evidence of Olmec innovations that predate later civilizations. Writing, calendrical structuring, colossal art, monumental architecture, all appear first in the Olmec sphere. Yet, archaeological research increasingly shows that contemporaneous societies, such as the Zapotecs of Oaxaca or the communities of central Mexico, were also experimenting with complex social forms. Rather than a single origin point, Mesoamerica may have been a constellation of cultures, each contributing to the region's development. Still, the Olmecs stand as the earliest to crystallize these elements into a recognizable civilization, the first to fuse trade, religion, art, and authority into a cohesive whole. Their legacy persisted in the very structure of Mesoamerican thought. The concept of the cosmos divided into layers, heavens above, underworld below, and the earthly plane in between, finds its earliest material expressions in Olmec art and ceremonial layouts. The symbolism of caves and mountains as portals to the divine world first appears in Olmec contexts, later becoming central to Maya and Aztec religious landscapes. The ritual ballgame, with its associations of cosmic order and sacrifice, has roots in Olmec times, evidenced by rubber balls recovered from the lowlands and depictions of ball players in early carvings. When later cultures reached their heights, they stood on Olmec foundations. The Maya refined writing into one of the most sophisticated scripts of the ancient world, yet their earliest glyphic traditions echo the precedent set by Olmec experimentation. The Aztecs organized their religious cosmos around gods of rain, maize, and fertility, divinities whose earliest forms can be traced back to Olmec iconography. Even in the post-classic period, long after the Olmec heartland had been abandoned, the memory of their achievements lingered in the myths and traditions of successor cultures. Today, standing before a colossal head at San Lorenzo or La Venta, one sees not just the face of a ruler long forgotten, but the weight of an entire civilization's vision. The stone is silent, yet it speaks in the language of endurance. The features carved over 3,000 years ago remain sharp, commanding, still gazing across the land that once pulsed with their people's power. The colossal heads were never toppled by time or conquest. They remained fixed in place, a reminder that the Olmecs were the first Americans of civilization, the ones who began the long experiment that would shape an entire continent's history.